Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Tadlock, and I'm the Director of Consulting Engineering here at TechSoft. Um, I've been here for about 5 years, and I've worked as a consulting engineer, and I've worked with our technology kind of on and off in different capacities. So, you know, I've got a little bit of a handle on it, and I'm hoping today to introduce you to the Hoops web platform, and then, we're going to kind of focus specifically on Hoops Communicator.
Thanks, thanks, Rob. We're gonna get started right now. I'm going to make you the host, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share your screen because you're going to be our tour guide for today. Looks
All
like we have
right.
some other people calling in from TechSoft as well. Mr. Merrifield, do you mind saying hello as well to people online because you're the guy that tends to be on the other end of the phone when people call for technical support.
Yeah, my name's Mike Merrifield. I'm a support manager, as Jonathan said, and happy to be here and um, get some insight into what everybody's learning about.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Mike. We're going to leave other people muted, but throughout the session, I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So if anybody has a question as Rob goes through his material, please don't hesitate to put that in the chat. If we don't get to it during the session, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer at the end. Um, we'll make sure we follow up with you answering that question. A little bit of information about what the schedule is going to look like. We have about an hour allotted to this. Rob's going to talk for 40 or so minutes with exercises, a few slides, and then we'll have a real opportunity for question and answer at the end. If we can kind of sneak a few in there during Robert's presentation, we will as well. But if we have those questions in the chat, we can kind of hit them rapid fire. So I think, Rob, we have about 74 people who've logged in. We're 2 minutes after the hour here. Feel free to get us kicked off and start talking about building our first web app. We're really eager to watch that.
Right. And so just real quick, Jonathan, we have someone asking if it's okay to record the seminar. I believe you will be recording. Is that correct? And you're sharing it?
Absolutely. So I have it recorded. It'll be available. We'll send out an email once we get that pushed up to our YouTube channel, and that can be shared with anybody who you think would benefit from it.
Great. Okay, so let's get started here. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. Let's see if I can do this the right way the first time. Go ahead and share, and then I'll start my... Okay, so everyone should see my slides. Is that what you see? Okay, great. Thanks, Jonathan. So once again, just for those joining, still coming in, my name's Robert Tadlock. I'm the director of our consulting team here at TechSoft 3D. I've been here, it'll be 5 years in July actually, and I've worked with Hoops Visualize and stuff for a number of years before that, so pretty familiar with the company, and I gotta say I really love it here, and I hope that comes out in this presentation. So just real quick, a little background on TechSoft 3D. It's a group of passionate people, and we're pretty driven to fuel innovation with unmatched 3D technology. And we do this by providing tools, expertise in various markets, and a tightly coupled partnership for each of our customers. And today we're going to be walking through building a simple web application with one of these tools, the Hoops web platform. So just a quick note about the agenda. This is going to be kind of just a presenter-led training, if you will. So we're going to pop up some exercises on the screen. You should have been granted access to the exercises before the call, and we're going to spend as little time as possible on slides. So just real quick, we're going to go over what you should expect from the session, prerequisites if you plan on participating in the exercises. We're going to do a quick introduction to the Hoops web platform. We're going to do a little bit deeper overview of Hoops Communicator. We'll jump into the exercises, and then any questions that you didn't get to ask during the chat, we will circle back and answer those at the end. And then we'll talk about kind of next steps or what I recommend you do from here. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm going to shoot for about 45 minutes, plus or minus. We'll do as many of the exercises as we can, but by the time we get, far enough along, it'll be pretty clear how you finish the exercises if you'd like to finish on your own. And then again, just one more time, feel free to ask questions in the chat if you are having setup problems or things like that. Jonathan will be monitoring that, and he may pass some of those questions on to me to answer. Okay, so what should you expect today? We're gonna, as I mentioned, we're gonna use the Hoops web platform, and specifically a tool called Hoops Communicator to go from a basic wireframe application on the left with nothing hooked up, just some icons and images and stuff, UI elements. And then when we're finished, we should have a working 3D enabled web application, a web page. We're gonna be using streaming to view this model, and we'll have some interaction with the viewer using the JavaScript API for Hoops Communicator. So if you want to follow along, you're going to need a few things. You're going to need some kind of text editor or IDE for coding. You can use whatever you'd like, Notepad++, Visual Studio, Sublime Text, anything like that. I will be using VS Code personally, and so that's what you'll be seeing. You'll need a web server of some sort. So this could be Apache, Nginx, IIS, some type of development server. There's a ton of them out there, Node.js. I personally will be using a plugin to Visual Studio Code, and I'll just turn that on at the beginning of the session, and it will be serving up the pages that we create. And then you're going to want the latest version of Hoops Communicator, and you can get that by following the link in the slides that we'll be providing you after the here, or the email that was sent to you before the this talk has all of these links as well. And then last, you'll want the included exercises. These exercises are the are kind of some training that we've built a few years ago, and also included with that is a Visual Studio, or sorry, a VS Code project to get up and running, because there are some setup setup things that you need to do to get Visual Studio Code working with the Hoops Communicator. So with that, I'm not sure if there's any questions, or if anybody doesn't have access to any of this, Jonathan can shoot those links and such in the chat if you need them. And again, you don't need to do these exercises. You can just follow along if you'd like. So next, we'll kind of have a quick introduction into what the Hoops web platform is. So TechSoft has a number of SDKs that help you solve various problems when building a new engineering-based application. So data import, data visualization, and report generation. And these include Hoops Exchange, Hoops Communicator, and Hoops Publish. But the kind of the magic sauce here is the tight integration between the three SDKs. So we make it very easy and seamless to a developer to import data, visualize it, interact with it, query it, and then create dynamic reports via 3D PDF. And so all of these are included in the Hoops web platform, along with the integrations between the various SDKs. So that's kind of the quick overview of what the Hoops web platform is. And if there's questions about licensing individual SDKs or the platform, those can also be directed to Jonathan at this time. So what is Hoops Communicator? So this is included in the Hoops web platform, and this is the tool that allows users to author data into our online streaming file format called Stream Cache. And you can either do direct authoring via a library that we allow you to author the Stream Cache files directly without going through any kind of import process. So this may be, if you've got an application with your own proprietary file format, you can still author that directly into Hoops Communicator. And we also offer the ability to import 30+ file formats via Hoops Exchange into Hoops Communicator Streaming Cache. And then the second part of Hoops Communicator is modeled visualization. So once you get that data imported into the tool, then you need a way to view it and interact with it, and that's the web viewer. And that can be accomplished in two ways. So direct file loading, so you can just kind of request these files over HTTP directly, pull down the entire file and view it in the browser, and there's no server requirements there. Or you can use our intelligent streaming mechanism, which requires our Hoops streaming server to reside somewhere in your application stack. And so there's a bit of an image over here on the right that lays out a little bit of this. It's if you can't see that right now, that's okay. I'll point you into our documentation where you can review this a little more closely. And before we jump to the Hoops Communicator documentation, I want to talk a little bit more about other things that you might need in a full-blown web application. So one of the things that my team does, a consulting team, is we go on site with partners and prospects, and we help them understand what are all of the moving parts to have a full web application. This can get as complex as you need, or it can be as simple as you need. And the complexity depends on a number of things, such as the number of concurrent users that your application is going to need to handle, the lifetime of a session. Are your sessions going to be where a customer pulls up a small, part, reviews it, looks at it really quickly, verifies that it's what they want, and then maybe orders it and then closes out the session? Or are your users going to have long lifetime sessions where they're maybe doing some modeling operations or markup or interrogation and things like that? And then you also want to take into the consideration the average size of data if you can. If you know that you're always working on airplanes, you're going to want to scale, you're going to want to create your server infrastructure to support that kind of data. And then, lastly, I always like to think about how quickly do you need to scale up and down? I think this is important, not just with Hoops Communicator and engineering-based web applications, but this is important for any kind of web application. Because the last thing you want to do is when your application or your company gets mentioned in the New York Times, you want to be able to scale up quickly for all those new users, and you want them to have a good seamless experience, right? And then there's all these other things to think about. There's what cloud service are you going to use? AWS, Google Cloud. There's tons of them. Are you going to have your own private cloud? Are you going to roll it your own? Is it going to be inside of the DMZ and not accessed by external users? Do you know what container technology is? Are you planning on using it? Security, that's paramount. Who's going to have access to these web services? How are you going to keep people's data safe when it's at rest? Things like that. So these are big questions, and they usually take some time during an evaluation and even after you sign a contract to work through. And the consulting team here at TechSoft is here and available to help answer those types of questions. So just quick overview of this image right here. We've got kind of what we have here on the left is your external users. So as you can see, Communicator works on mobile devices, desktop devices, laptops. And this is just kind of one sample way that you might lay something out. Your architecture here is that the customers of the clients, they're running the Hoops web viewer in their browser, and they're going to connect to your load balancer, which may, dynamically may ask your web service on AWS or some kind of container service to spin up web servers as needed, and those may go to some kind of container service or proxy server to then ask for a viewing instance, which then would be connected back directly to the client. And as you see, those streaming servers would be reading the files, the stream cache files, off of a file server. And they're going to be streaming that data down as needed, as the client needs it. And here, this is a pretty simplified version. You may have, firewalls, different firewalls here, like you may have multiple load balancers. There may be a proxy server that is just a single piece of hardware, and it's not scaling up or down. It's not dynamically allocated. Those back servers may be Docker. There's a lot of things that can be changed in this sample image here. So next thing we're going to do here is I'd like to come over to our documentation here. So Jonathan, if you could please share this link in the chat. This is our online documentation for Hoops Communicator. And we'll kind of quickly go over this. You can feel free to follow along. We changed this documentation. We updated it pretty drastically about 6 months ago, so it may not be familiar to all of the Hoops Communicator partners that are out there. But what we did here is, I kind of want to call some attention to this, is we built some really nice tutorials here that walk you through building, full-blown applications. Some of them have Communicator running right in them. And these are, some of them are market vertical oriented, like the additive manufacturing. And we deliver all of this as source code, and you can work through these. You can use the code in your application. You can use it for learning and training. And so I would go ahead and, if you are thinking about building a new application, or you're evaluating Hoops Communicator, or you're a current partner and you're going to start working on that, have a look at these tutorials. They're pretty useful. Then there's the programming guide here, and we're going to focus on that for a moment. So Communicator is broken down into really 3 logical chunks. We talked a little bit about the servers, and we talked a little bit about the viewing, and a little bit about the data import. And the package, when we look at the package here in just a second, you're going to notice that we lay out the package in the same way. So depending on what you're doing, you can ask yourself, what part of the package am I in? What part of the components am I looking at? And that can help guide you to the right area of the documentation. So it's like, am I working with converter? I'm doing data import. Okay, we come over here to data import, and we see CAD conversion or authoring, which is what I mentioned earlier. Most users are going to be in the CAD conversion here, and they're going to be using the CAD conversion application, which we call converter.exe. And this is an application that runs and allows you to specify a number of options. You can create thumbnails, you can import CAD files, you can create XML files with the product structure. There's a lot you can do, and there's a whole bunch of command line options that you can look through here and play with. And this is shipped in the package. And then also we have a library version of that. So if you don't want to run the executable, but maybe you want to link in the library directly into your application, you can do that as well. And then a little bit about the servers here. We're not going to focus a ton on this today, but what we will be using today is the Hoops server, and specifically the streaming cache servers. So we'll be using both of these. The Hoops server is a tool that we ship that allows, it kind of manages the life cycle of streaming instances. And the streaming instances are the stream cache, or from the stream cache server. So one stream cache instance will serve one viewing instance. So every user that comes to your site and ultimately is viewing a model, if they're using the streaming, they are connected to one of those streaming cache instances. And the Hoops streaming server is a tool that we provide to manage the life cycle of those instances. You'll find once you get into development that you may not need the Hoops server, and you might want to have your own application manage that life cycle. And maybe, maybe you're running your Hoops, your streaming cache servers via Docker or something, and you've got a good mechanism to control the life cycle of those. You don't necessarily need the added functionality from our Hoops server. So it's pretty flexible in the way that you use it. But today, will be the Hoops server and the streaming cache server is what we'll be using. We're not going to be going in depth on those. What we will be focusing on today, and if you are following along, you're going to want to have this open, is the viewing overview in the programming guide, and then lastly, you're gonna want to have the API reference open for the viewer. So the viewer has a few top level classes, the model view, the view class, and then let's see here. So, and then we've also got a few different, I thought I turned all that off. And then we've got a few different operator classes, enumerations, and things like that. So keep this open. And as we go through the exercises here, you're gonna wanna come in here and search. So for example, like if we're doing something on the view, you'll come into the view class and you'll be able to see the API for that and stuff in here. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to switch over to the exercises here just a second. We'll look at the package. And before I do that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for 1 second so I can move a few things around. I had to make my resolution pretty small. So, yeah, let me get that set up here. Okay. So we'll get this going. Got to stop this. Okay. All right, so I'll get Visual Studio Code open here, and we'll get going here. Move this onto my big screen. Okay, share my screen again here. Right. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start by looking at the Communicator package. When you download the package, I'm on Linux, so it's a a gzip file, but it'll be a zip file if you're on Windows. And then you'll unzip it, or you'll use the installer, and it will install this for you where you specify. And once that's done, you should have a folder structure that looks pretty similar to this. And so let's kind of go through this very quickly. So the web viewer has the source code for the JavaScript web viewer. There's no plugins required to run Communicator. It's all JavaScript based, and it uses WebGL. So these are your files here. You got a sample file, and then the actual JavaScript files to run are in here. And then if we come back here, we've got the authoring folder, as I mentioned earlier. This is where you're going to find the binary to convert files into stream cache. So you can provide it CAD files and things like that, and then output a stream cache file. We've got various types of stream cache files, so I'll just mention that very quickly. We've got the SC files, which are your streaming files. So these are files that get streamed down to the web viewer dynamically. You can also create an SCS file, which is a monolithic file, and it's meant to be read from the file structure directly using HTTP. So there's no streaming. The way that works is the web client pulls that file all the way down via an asynchronous call, and then when it gets fully downloaded to the user's browser, then the display happens. Versus dynamically, the display happens as soon as the data reaches the viewer, and that's done over a WebSocket connection, the streaming. So again, we can come back to authoring. Here's the library version that I mentioned of Converter. So this is just a dynamic, a DLL, and you link it into your application, and then you can use Converter, pretty much provide all the same arguments to it, and you just use it via an API rather than command line options. And then lastly, we've got the libsc, which is, these are libraries to actually author the file structure, the stream cache directly. So this would be, the way this would work is you'd link this into your application. Say you've got some kind of custom brep file format, and you want to get that in a stream cache. Well, then your application would walk through the topology and geometry of your file format, and along the way you're authoring the geometry in the stream cache using the API here. And then at the end, you'd have a stream cache file that can be viewed Communicator in the web viewer. We provide some documentation here if you're not using the online documentation. And then in here's the server. So we've got a legacy server, and then in Hoops 2020 we created a new Node.js based server. And for this, I mean the Hoops server that does the management of the stream cache instances, of the streaming server instances, sorry. So you don't need to use these, but they are available. And then in here directly, you'll see a few of the binaries. So you've got the server. This is the legacy server to manage the life cycle of these SC server app instances. And then you've got the SC server app. This is kind of where the rubber meets the road. So when this gets started up, the way it starts up is it's bound to an IP and a port. And then the web viewer needs to know the IP and the port that it's supposed to connect to, which you provide it to, and then it connects to one of these SC server app instances, and then the data is then streamed down to that web viewer. And then we've got this folder, which is what we're going to be working out of today. So if you're following along here, you should be coming into the QuickStart folder, and then, just to verify that everything runs, you should run this start server if it's a bat file on Windows or a shell script on Linux. And then this will start a self-contained, and I will start this now just to show you. It's on my other screen, but you'll see it in a second. So I'll move this onto my shared screen now. So what I've done here is I've gone into the QuickStart here, and I'm gonna start the server. And what you'll see is it's got some output here saying, okay, I'm started up, I'm listening on this port, and it's just gonna be waiting. So what you do from the QuickStart here is we come to the index. So if you open this up, you'll see, oh, okay, we've got a bunch of different files here we can load. So let's look at anybody that's been around TechSoft for, the last 20 years knows about BNC. So we load the BNC connector, and we are now viewing this model. I'm interacting with it. I'm selecting, this is kind of a sample web viewer that we ship. So you're free to use this application. Use the code in here, these UI elements, all of that. There's a sample model browser in here. And so that's what you're seeing here. And what's nice about the QuickStart here is it's completely self-contained. So when you start this up, we ship a small web app, web server in here. It's running the Hoops server, and it's also, as you access and load files, it's starting up streaming cache instances for you, and then you're connecting to those. And so this is the quickest way to get started with Communicator when you get the package downloaded and installed. You come into here, you start the server up, and you can start poking around. And so there's a number of different files here. You can see PMI, you can load SCS or streaming. You can do server-side rendering as well, which I haven't mentioned yet, but to do that, you have to have a GPU-enabled device. And then down here is some nice little sample code bytes that you can consume. And so what's nice about these is they are really small little bits of code. They're easy to read through. They're easy to understand. And then, so like this one does a quick, it shows you how to use the cutting planes, right? And so what's nice is you could just come in and grab sample code out of these and include them in your application. And you can use the QuickStart to kind of come through the library and say, oh, what do I need to do? Do I want to do instancing, model switching? How do I do a basic minimal web viewer, right? And then we just provide you that code. So pretty straightforward. It's nice. So what we're going to be doing today, though, is, and the reason I spent a little bit of time on the QuickStart is the training that was provided to you, you just drop directly into this QuickStart here. So when you drop that in here, some JavaScript files will get dropped in here. And also you'll see this, you should have this exercise file. you'll see this microengine.json file, which we're using as like a mock database. There's a README as well that shows you how to get this all up and running. So it just basically tells you to drop everything into wherever you installed it. And then once you've done that, you can come to the exercise folder. So we'll do that in just a second. So if we've got the QuickStart running, so let me come back here. If I'm moving too quickly, just let Jonathan know. And if there's questions, please let him know. But you see, I still have this running. So if we were to come back here and we were to come to my local host, it's 11.180, which is what you saw earlier. But we could also change this to exercises. And then you'll see the start for what we're going to be working on today. So this is now, all this is an empty web page with some UI elements that are not hooked up to anything. They don't do anything, like, right? But you can see that they would do something if we coded them up, which is what we're going to start moving into now. So this is kind of where everyone should be if you want to participate in these exercises. I'm going to pause here for just a minute and give everybody a little bit of time to make sure that that's working, and I'm going to look at the chat to see if there's any issues, and then we'll start coding, and I'll show you my development setup. So I'm going to jump in here and look at the chat now, see if there's any issues here.
Yeah, so the only question that came up so far, Rob, was a question about the difference between the SCS and SC files, which is what we use with Hoops Communicator.
Uh-huh.
And for those who are familiar with TechSoft, we have a desktop-based graphics engine called Hoops Visualize. So that utilizes your native development environment. So it's not something that runs within a web browser. Those file formats are called HMF or HSF. Those are TechSoft file formats. The only real difference between those, they're comparable but different. The nice thing about SCS and SC files is because they come and are bound natively to the CAD file, it's possible to include BREP data. So one of the benefits of Hoops Communicator is you can measure face-to-face angles, the length of lines, the radius of arcs, circular arcs, and that's something that we've kind of improved upon our original file format with these Communicator file formats. And then the other thing that is quite good about those are they are streamable. So you can have the data on the server and stream down to a web client, and you can begin visualizing data without having to download the entire model. And there's a number of different ways you can clamp memory and delay load certain sub-assemblies. So there's a lot of functionality for this kind of client server type architecture for the SCS files.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm gonna start sharing my screen here again, and I'm just gonna kind of stream of consciousness walk you through what I'm doing here. So if I'm speaking too quickly or I've said something that you have a question on, feel free to ping us in the chat. I'll stop and we will review that. So what I did here is I just stopped the server that was running in the QuickStart because I'm not going to be using that for these exercises. So I'll go ahead and close this out. What I will do is open up Visual Studio Code, and we will have a quick look at this setup here. So if you're familiar with Visual Studio Code, it's pretty cool. Mostly I use it because it runs on Linux and I like it. But it's pretty popular, I think, with web development these days. You can also do, like I do my C++ development on Linux with it. It's flexible. It does a lot of things. But with any tool that's like really, really flexible, you can paint yourself into a corner, shoot yourself in the foot. Any of those analogies apply here. But what I've provided you inside of the training is a workspace file here. And all I really did here is set up running the Communicator server, the Hoops server, automatically when I launch my code. So as we mentioned earlier, there's two things that we're going to need to run basically here is we're going to need a web server, and then we're going to need Hoops Communicator to run the streaming server. So the web server I'm going to turn on right now. It's a plugin inside of VS Code that I've installed here. And if you're not familiar with that, you can do extensions here. And I think if you just type live server, you'll see it right here. I have it installed. It's pretty popular for web development here. 5 million downloads, 5.3. And so the way that works is you can just turn it on or off, or if you're launching HTML files, it can be configured to start up when you start the file or when you run that file and then shut down when you're done. I like to configure it to just turn on at my session here. So I turn it on. The web server's running my entire development session. And then from there, all I need to do is configure a launch task to run the server. And so what am I doing? We're doing two things here. First, this launch task is just saying launch Chrome and go to this URL, which is 5500 is my web server URL. So all I'm doing is saying launch Chrome and go to this URL and view this web page. So if we do that now, if I do F5, it's gonna start that up. You'll see it's take a second. Okay, there we go. Start up. This is what we saw earlier. So now we've got our basic wireframed application. So I'll stop that here. And then the other thing that you might notice is we have a pre-launch task. So that is what is starting the web server from the QuickStart. So all I'm doing is, you saw me run that start server.sh file earlier. I'm just saying before I launch the browser, I need you to start up the Hoops server for me so that I can make connections to it via WebSockets. So that's all I'm doing here. And if you're familiar with VS Code, I'm also doing a few other things like checking that it started correctly and stuff like that. But that's about it. And that's all I'm really providing you in that workspace for VS Code here. And then the other thing that you're going to see here is you'll see this exercises.html. This is what we're going to be working in today. So if you see this, the way this works is you'll see there's exercise numbers in here. So we're going to exercise 1 and then 2 and 3. Now they're not sequentially because they're laid out more in the order of the application, how you would build it rather than, being sequential in the HTML file. And then lastly, what I like to do is if you're using VS Code, you're following along, is I like to view the terminal. So I go to view terminal somewhere over here. Yeah, right here, or control plus backtick. And then, because I can also stop the server here. So I ran F5 earlier. It did the pre-launch task and it started the server. I haven't configured it to stop the server. It'll just leave it. But you may want to stop it. You can do that in the terminal by just doing Control C.
Hey, Rob, what port is that running on again?
The port for the server is on 11.182. And then the port for the web server is configured on 5500.
All right, so if you wanted to see that in your browser, somebody asked what port, so you said 5555 again?
Well, so 5500 is my web server on here. That you may be running your web server on 80, most likely, because that's the default port is 80. You may have yours configured, like a lot of JSP and Apache servers. Tomcat, for example, runs on 8080. So it really depends on what your web server is configured on. If you're using the built-in web server in here, like say you start server, then you just go. It's just going to be, you're going to come in here, you're going to run this, and this is running locally, no server. When I click on this, you'll see it's 11.180 at the bottom. So I don't know if you see that down at the bottom there. So like if I click this, it's a localhost 11.180, but this is running a viewer sample. So, and I also don't have the server running right now. So that's why that's not going there. So let me step back here and explain a little bit more before we go into what's going on here. We've got two servers. We've got the web server, which I turned on as a plugin into Visual Studio. What's that going to do? All that's going to do is serve up my exercise.html on port 5500 because that's what it's configured at in my development environment. So if I start right now, you'll see that. So this is no different than just running a web application or web page, an HTML web page from a web server somewhere. So if you've got Apache running, you would put this exercise.html wherever you're serving your web pages from. So in like the /var/www folder in Apache, right? So that's that. And then so that we can run and connect to streaming instances, we're also launching the QuickStart server here. So this QuickStart server is what we just looked at in the QuickStart folder earlier, right? That's all I'm doing is running this, which, by the way, is running its own web server and all that. So you don't even need Visual Studio Code or anything. You can code right from here. So let me show you what that would look like. So if we were to start the server here, I could start this server right from here. And this would start, and then you'll see I could edit this file directly right in here. So like I could edit this with Sublime Text, or I could drop it in here and edit it. And that I could work that way. So then all you would do is, if you were working that way, is let me grab this here, is we'll open up a terminal here and I'll show you. Okay, I'll grab the terminal. So say okay, I'm in the quick start here. So if I start the server, right, now this is running, I could just edit that file now, the exercise.html, and we could go there and start working with it. So you don't need an IDE per se, you just need something to, edit the file. I've just set this up here so that I have kind of an integrated environment, so I can start and stop, and I don't have to mess with the terminal or anything like that. So that's kind of what we're doing. Okay, so why is this popped up here? All right, okay, so we can see the screen here. Let's start. I'm gonna work through the first exercise here with you, and then the way we're gonna do this is we'll start the exercise. I'll ask you to code it, and then I'm gonna unshare my screen and I'll code it up along with you, and then we'll look at it together. So in this first exercise, we're being asked to create the web viewer with the model and load the micro engine, and then set the following callbacks. So let's see how we would go about that. So remember, we opened up the Communicator documentation earlier. I like to have the programming guide open first. If you come over here to the overview and the basic setup, we show you right here how to launch the viewer, right? So this first one is a gimme. Let's code that up, and we'll do it together. And then on the subsequent ones, I'll have you do it yourself. Okay, so it says create the viewer, set these callbacks, and then we need to start the viewer as well. So let's do that. Okay, so just real quickly, the way this exercise works, I've created some variables at the top for you. We're also doing an AJAX call when the document loads. We're making an asynchronous call to the Hoop server, asking it for a streaming resource. So, so that's happening as soon as we load this page, and then we're getting a resource back here. You'll see we're making the AJAX call here. We're posting to the server, and we're asking it for a resource. We're posting this little JSON object here saying, please give me a client-side resource session, a client-side rendering session. And then it's going to give us back an endpoint. And then we'll have that endpoint, which will be a WebSocket endpoint. So that's kind of where you're going to start the code here. And if we come back and look at the code here, it needs to start with a container ID. This one, they're loading SCS, but we are going to do this by loading streaming. So we're going to also need an endpoint URL. And you might see some of that down here. You'll also see that we're starting how to set callbacks. So let's go back in here and start that. Okay, so we have a viewer object, right? So what I want to do is I want to take that viewer and I want to create a new communicator .web viewer. And coding in front of like 100 people is nerve-wracking. Okay, so we'll come up here and all right, and then there's a few things that, you know, if we come back to here, what do we have to do? We needed a container ID, and the container ID is an HTML, like a div. Where are we going to place it on the canvas or on the web page? So let's come down here just real quick and look at the HTML. It's a very basic page here, but you'll see most of this is code for the UI. I think it's called, let's see, container ID or something like that. Let's find it. View button. Oh yeah, my container right here. So we've just created an empty container to place the web viewer in. Okay, so we know now it's my container. So let's go back up here and start that up. So what do we need to do? We need to do a container ID. And that will be my container, I believe. And then we need, from that other, so we need a model to load. And here we said micro engine. I'll show you where that exists in just 1 second. And then one thing that you didn't see on that page I just linked you to is that we're going to be using the streaming resource here. So we need an endpoint URI for that. So endpoint let me look over here. Yeah, I have the docs off to the side here, URI. And then actually, so what that is that's going to be endpoint, right? Because that's what we got from up here. Right, so we've created the viewer here. We haven't set any callbacks and we haven't started the viewer. So those are so we need to set the callbacks here. So if this doesn't make sense to anybody, just post a question in to Jonathan and I can go into further detail here. So now we need to set the callbacks.
2 questions.
Yep.
So first, small typo, web viewer versus instead of web viewer. Make sure you have an IE in web viewer. And then the important one, Rob, you're doing awesome. You're doing awesome.
Yeah, oh, I see. Thanks for the typo. That's great.
Yeah, that shows that it's live.
This is paired programming at its max. I like it.
Yeah, well, who said that? Julian said that. And then, can you create an empty web viewer? Is a really good question.
Right. Yes, you can.
Yeah.
So,
and then the last question was, where can we get the training material? And so that was in an email that was sent out. I'm going to post that to the chat so you can kind of download the material in just a second here. Okay.
Right, and it's yeah, so it's a Dropbox link that Jonathan will give you, and it has all this training material in it. And then at the end, I also have an exercise complete, like I have the answers to all of these. We'll send that out afterwards. I didn't want to send it out in the original Dropbox because I figured it would have spoiled all the fun. So we'll send that out afterwards. So, okay, great. So then let's keep moving here, and I'll come back to here. And now the next thing I asked us to do was to set the callbacks here. So you can see how we do that, all right? So and the callbacks that we were asked to set were the camera changed, selection, view created, and model structure ready. So let's go back and look at that. So what you do with these is you can set these kind of to be inline anonymous functions. But I think the better practice is to create the function that you want to set it to and then give it the name of that function. So in this case, we'll say viewer.set callbacks. Let me look over here. Yeah, it's lowercase. And then we're going to set the callbacks. And so like I said, we could do something like this, camera, and then you could just say, function, an anonymous function here like this, and you could do that. But personally, I think it's better to just create a function and give it the name. So I've already done that here. So camera changed, and you'll see, and then we'll do selection change. And you see, this is what I kind of like about VS Code, is you get completion and stuff like that. So it knows that these are already created. right? So, and I'll show you those in just a second where they exist. And then we'll do view created. What did I set that? That I don't know. Oh, you know why? It's because I call it redline created. I'm looking at that. And then we're going to do this one. What was the last one? View created. I don't, yeah. So for now, we'll do that. And then let me just quickly show you that these are functions that exist down here. So I believe you see selection changed. You see redline created. We got to fill these out. They don't do anything yet, but that's kind of like what I recommend when you're setting these callbacks is you can do them all in line, but it can get messy. Sometimes if you just want to do something very quickly and or whatever, toggle a state, it's nice to have like just a little small anonymous function. But if you're going to be setting lots of them, it can get messy. And then the last thing we need to do is start the viewer. Right, so that should be what we want to do here. Okay, so if we're ready here, let's see, I'll start this up. It's starting the stream cache server. It's loading the web page, and then voila, we've got the model loaded here, right? So pretty straightforward there, pretty easy. We're just loading the model. We're connecting to a streaming cache server, and we're reading a file, and we're streaming that down. Now, where does this file live, and how are we getting it? We'll go to that next. So, oops, let's come back to the package here. So we're in the package. Again, the QuickStart model here, we've got converted models. I think you got standard here, SC models, and then you'll see we've got all of these engines we can load. And by the way, you're seeing a different file extension here, SCZ. That is just the zipped version of SC, of streaming cache. So the streaming cache is a collection of files, and then by default, we zip them and call it SCZ. So the way that when you start a server, when you start a streaming cache server, when this gets started, it needs to know where to find the models from. So that's part of what the Hoops server is doing in this case here. It's starting up the streaming server, and it's telling it where the models that it can load live. So it's basically giving it that directory that I just showed you. And then any of those files that are in there are available by name. So that's that. Okay, so now what we'll do is we'll search for exercise 2. Wait, let me stop. Actually, I'll stop this. And I'll stop my server here, and we'll search for exercise. It's 2. Right. So everybody, let's come down into here, and we're going to work on this next. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll write the code, and then we'll come back and look at it together. And I'd like you to search through the documentation and see if you can find that. So let me, yeah. So you should be on the documentation. You can see loading models, attributes. Maybe you have to search, use the search at the top of in the documentation. But I'll start to write this code, and we'll come back. It'll be, I don't know, a few minutes here, and we'll come back and look at this. And just so I know what time it is, it's 11:53. Great.
Yeah, so we had a question about loading models. I'll just answer it as you're coding that up, Robert.
Okay.
The question to everyone was, maybe we'll get to this, but can you load multiple models? And the answer is yes. You can add models dynamically. So you start the viewer, and then there's a API call to the viewer, like load submodel, and you give it an additional SCS file that you've created, and it'll load that into the existing scene. Or at the time of creation, when there's always this step, like how do you get the SCS file? That's not a SolidWorks file. It's not a Revit file. It's not an IFC or DWG. There's always this step prior to loading it into the viewer normally, where you convert your original CAD model into the streaming form. and it's using an executable in the package called converter.exe. That leverages Hoops Exchange. It is able to convert, read, and then create, read over 30 different CAD file formats. So at the time of creating that SCS or SCZ or SC file, you can import several CAD models into that end streaming cache file, and then you have access to that.
Right, and so one of the things you do have to do when you load multiple other models is you generally create another node in the model tree, and then you load the model into that other node, and you can give it, you know, a transformation matrix, or you can give it other kind of properties like that when you load it as well. Okay, let me. Yeah, so I generally, when I'm coding, and I like to keep the API reference on my other monitor or off to the side, and so I can, you know, code and then search through the reference at the same time. So to load, I'll give you a tip here. To load a model, and you're going to want to you want to access the model class in the viewer API. So if you saw the API reference earlier, there's a model. Model is one of the top level classes. You're going to want to access the model class for this.
So there was another question about, do you need a license to or login to use Converter? So part of the download that you have includes Hoops Converter, or the converter.exe. You can find that in the folder under authoring Converter, and there's a number of command line arguments that allow you to do that convert, or we've tried to make it as simple as possible for you in the QuickStart program. If you drag a CAD file on top of convert file.bat, it'll just automatically convert that CAD file for you using some default command line parameters, so you can start working with that.
And it does use you do need a license key, and when you evaluate the software, we give you an evaluations license. And if you go into the examples folder of the authoring for Converter, you'll see some examples in there that are in a batch file, and you'll see they pass in the license key.
Another question is, could the SCS file be served from any static server? And
Right,
the answer
yes.
is yes. Yep, and that's one of the real benefits, is your infrastructure for creating your servers can be much more minimal. The problem there is we tend to utilize SCS files mostly for small files. Once you get large assemblies, the string cache server gives a better user experience, because you immediately start getting data in. When you try to create a large SCS file from a large assembly, it does take a little while for that first render to come up. Files like this micro engine or single parts work perfectly fine with SCS files.
Okay, so check my code here, make sure it works.
And then the last question that we have here, you can add nodes to the model, but does it also work for updating existing nodes in the model tree? Maybe
You can
Rob.
replace nodes in the model tree. I don't know the API off the top of my head, but you can replace nodes, you can remove them. So yeah, you can change nodes.
Yep. And then can you mix and match SC and SCS files? That's a really good question.
No.
Okay.
Because when you start the viewer, you are telling it, you're basically starting it in which mode it's going to start in. So I'm either going to reach out and make a connection to the server, or I'm going to be standalone. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again, and we will look at the code. Okay, So first of all, I'll run the code and show you what it should look like when you are finished. So our model loads here, and all we've done now is we've basically, when you click on these now, you can load a different model, right? We're replacing the model here. And then here we set, you were also asked to override the PMI color and set it to black, and that's because we're on a white background, and by default it's white. And so that way when you view this model, you don't see white text on white background. So that's what this should be doing. Anybody having problems with that? Is that working for everyone? And then we can look at the code here. And I'm sorry, you might hear my cats trying to get into my office. I apologize for that. I'm working from home. Okay, so let's look at the code here. What do? We have a function called load model. If we search for this in the model here, you see that I've wrote some code that adds an on-click event to these anything with a thumbnail CSS class. So those images have been assigned the .thumbnail CSS class, and we are preventing the default click. And then what are we doing? We are grabbing the attribute from that there. So if we look at this in a second, that's basically the name. So we've attached this class called thumbnail to this HTML object, and then we've attached an attribute, which is the name of the model that we want to load. And we're just passing that into that function that we just created. And then we are also then updating, we're updating something by its ID in the web page with the model name. So this is probably, I'm not sure whatever this points to. We'd have to look. It's some kind of HTML element, a div or the title or something like that. And then we're restoring the default operators, meaning we're resetting the viewer to the way it was initially instantiated. We can look at that function in a second. But so that's why when you filled this function out, it started working, because we already had the wiring in place. We just had to fill out the function. So what do we do here? Well, the first thing we're doing is checking to see that we got something actually passed into the function. And then if we did, as I mentioned earlier, it's on the model class. So now you're going to start to see that the viewer is the top level object, but you can get access to the model, to the view, to the operator manager, and they're all in these getter functions. So we're saying viewer.getModel, excuse me, and then switch to model. So there's a function, utility function that just allows you to switch models. So we switch that model, we pass that in, and then what a lot of the functions do, the design pattern for most of the functions in communicators, they return a promise. And if you're not familiar with promises, they're just a kind of an updated way to control the non-synchronous, so the asynchronous manner of JavaScript. So in the past, it was callbacks, and you would fire the callback and and you would provide an anonymous function. Well, now it's a little bit cleaner way called promises, and they return at some indeterminate time, and you just give it an anonymous function that will asynchronously be fired when this is done. So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, this is a nice little control mechanism here. It's saying when this asynchronous behavior returns, I want you to do something, and I'm providing it an anonymous function here. This can be the name of a function as well, just like what we did earlier when we looked at the setting the callbacks. But in this case, we're just using an anonymous function. I'm saying when the model is finally loaded, I want you to set the color, and I want you to override the default color of the model being loaded. So, so what we've done here is both of those live off the model class as well. So we set it, and you'll see that Communicator also has some nice kind of utility functions to define basic colors. That's what we're using here. And let's come back and look at the API reference here, which I think is here. Nope, that's not it. Here, let's do this. Here. Okay. So you can see, let's see, colors, right? So here's the color enum, or class rather, sorry. And you got red, green, white, yellow, blue, things like that. You can create your own stuff. And let's come back and look at the model class, what's in there. So we got the model classes right here. There's a lot of stuff here, right? We can get the PMI color, set PMI color, we can get filters. You can delete nodes, as we talked about earlier. We can create nodes. So a lot of stuff in here. This is going to be one of your main classes that you're going to interact with Communicator. You can create meshes. So you can create geometry directly in the web viewer. And there's functions to do that. So yeah, a lot of stuff going on in here. This is a class you're going to want to look at a lot. The other class you're going to want to look at a lot is the view here. So a lot of stuff going on. Camera. Those get used a lot. Okay, let's move right along here because I think I've taken up more time than I promised. All right, so let's look for number 3. So number 3 function here should be line 201. So we want to add the code here to reset the camera and set the transition time to a half a second. So this is going to be your home button. Like you push the home button and we've got some kind of, we've interacted with the model, we've zoomed, we've moved, we're going to push home and it's going to come back to where it was initially set. So let's do that now. We'll code that up, should be quick, and then we'll come back and I'll show you my code. Okay, so let's see what's the, got some, I think this is okay, I'm gonna come back here. We're gonna share my screen again. We'll move through this one's pretty straightforward. So I'll start share my screen now. Okay, so all we did here, this is a function on the get view and we reset the camera. Again, it's on a click event for the, there's a button that has an ID called home button. And let me show you how I found, because I couldn't remember what the name of this camera was. So I had to type it in over my docsing and I'll show you how I found that. So I'm on the API docs here and all I typed was, camera, because I figured it was something on camera. And I looked down and I saw reset camera. And I obviously know that's what it called once I saw it. You might have to click through a few different things, but once you get used to it. And so what do we do here? Reset camera and we give it a duration. Again, returns a promise. So if we come back here, we reset the camera. I gave it milliseconds. And we'll go ahead and run this and see what that looks like. So we're loading here. Okay. And we'll do that. Let's click the home button. Whoop. Easy peasy. All right. Any questions on that? So I think you're starting to see that, I think the hard part of using Communicator, or at least the mental hurdle for most people, is understanding, your network topology or your application topology. What are all the moving parts to make a scalable web app? And luckily, that's the hard part of any web app. So there's a lot of people out there to help you. We're here to help you. But then once you get that all in place, actually using the web viewer is pretty straightforward. It's a nice JavaScript API. You've got a searchable API document, and then you just kind of like figure it out and play around with it and go from there. So let's move on to the next exercise here. So we'll search for number 4. Boop, right there. So here, this one's a little bit longer. We want to set the view orientation here. So if we look at, let's come back here. So this is camera options, and there's a list of camera options. Let's come back and let me start the web app up again, and I'll show you this. So the idea here for this exercise is that we want all of these options right here to be hooked up, right? So what I've done here is I've purposely made these names match the text that needs to be passed into the enumeration. So let's go ahead and look at the, let me get the right here. So I think it was, let's see. So if we do like isometric, so we search, oops, right? So you see view orientation. So come look at, get started here. This is what we're going to be passing in. So you want to hook those up to this enumeration, and you want to use the function that changes the view orientation. So let's code that up, and then we'll have a look at the code. And Jonathan, let me know how we're doing on time here. I think I'm running over, but you let me know if we've got a bit more time here.
You know, maybe we can, you're doing awesome. Thanks, Rob. There's a lot of content there. I know this was part of like a multi-session training course. Let's open it up to some questions. Like we launched the web viewer. We kind of showed them the view class, the model class, the camera class. I think that's a really fantastic start. I know we got a ton of material. Everybody on our sessions should also have access to Hoops Communicator and the Hoops web platform, the downloadable package and the documentation. There are three or four different getting started tutorials there. But let's take a minute and just see if there's any questions, and we can also talk about where to go next in terms of next steps. Is that okay?
Yep, that works. That works. Absolutely.
So a couple things in terms, if you have a question, you can raise your hand or type it there in the chat. You know, but Rob, thanks. That was a ton of content. And it did give us a good taste. I think you have, what, 13 or 14 different steps there in the tutorial or the exercise?
Right.
Yeah, so there's a lot to work through there, kind of showing you all the nuts and bolts of the Hoops web platform. A couple things coming up. We do have a product overview and happy hour tomorrow, and that's pretty exciting. We're not going to be rolling code, but we're going to be talking about the new release of Hoops Communicator and all of our other products at TechSoft. So we have a 4 p.m. European and a 4 p.m. East Coast US session tomorrow. So it hopefully is a little bit more acceptable to people's schedules, as well as several other online sessions talking about manufacturing, building, and construction. All of those are online. They can be registered for, if you go to techsoft3d.com, they can be registered online. But in terms of this material itself, we'd love to have you at those sessions. But in terms of building your first web application, you have the package, you have the exercises. Feel free to work through that. And then if you want to do more than just dabble with your web app, but actually start working on a real proof of concept, and work on like what it looks like to distribute this as part of your products, we encourage you to reach out to Robert and our team here. And there's a number of different ways to do that. Probably the easiest way is on our website. Just click on Contact Us, and we can get you set up with one of our consulting engineers. So that's Robert and his team. They sit with you, team program, and kind of work through your very specific problems, how to distribute, how to connect it into your existing workflows and your existing application architecture.
Yeah, so I would encourage everyone to, continue to work through these exercises and, reach out to us if you've got questions, and I hope that this has been helpful.
All right, any other questions? Rob, you want to show us the last coding exercise?
Yep, I'll go through that right now. I'll share my screen. I'll show you kind of what that looks like. Okay, share the screen here. All right, so this is pretty straightforward. As I said, this one's a bit contrived in that I've set it up so that we're taking the text. So the text has to be specifically set in your application. Probably not the best coding practice here. You might have some kind of, map or something. But we're taking that text and we're passing it into the set view orientation, and then we're using the enumeration here to figure out which one's clicked, and we're setting a time that it happens. And so what does that look like when we go here, we load this model. Now we've got these views here, so we can set isometric back. And so, you know, this one is going to be a very similar exercise, although not quite as contrived. So you will have to do like maybe a switch statement or something in there. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. And then you work through the rest of this exercise. You're going to work through creating markups. So how to create and save markups, save markup views, how to take a snapshot, an image. You'll set up cutting planes, the explosion operator. We'll start to look at how the triangle count of the model, the frames per second we're getting. And then we have a little exercise where you click something here and we tie it into something that's in like your application database. So pricing and the name and things like that, that would be stored in another system. And then that's about it as far as this exercise goes.
Great, thanks, Rob. We got a lot. We probably have enough for a whole other session, huh?
Yeah, there's a lot here. I mean, like you said, this is generally something we work through over the course of about a half day in person with people, and it's usually in a class setting. And this would be like your general introduction to Communicator, and then after that, we could have a consulting engineer come on site with you specifically and work through your very specific application questions and code and things like that.
Great. So I think that was a question. Can you review your source code lastly? So I think we were able to accomplish that. Is there any limitation to the size of an SC file? That is a good question. I think one thing to keep in mind is when you go from a CAD file, which tends to have a lot of bloat in terms of historical modeling information, the SC file is immediately much smaller than the original CAD file. So we can see a reduction of let's say 80% of the file size. So if you have a 100 megabyte CAD assembly, it gets pushed down to 20 megabytes when it comes to a SC file, or even less, depending on the type of conversion parameters that you include and how we do that. Outside of that, the largest SC files that we've seen, we've taken there's kind of like a test data set called it's the Boeing 777 that Boeing created for us. It was originally, I believe, a 30 gigabyte CATIA model. We're able to visualize that. We do some interesting things on the client side, even though the SC file ends up being like 4 gigabytes in size by the time we're done working with it. We're able to clamp the memory. That's one parameter of the web viewer, is we can clamp the memory that we use and swap in and out geometry. So you can look at, let's say, the turbine or the cockpit, and it'll swap out all of the seating or the tail of it. So I'm not sure if we've tested what the absolute upper bound of our SC files are, but the biggest data sets that we can find and throw at it, we've been able to and have been successful. All right, great. Let's probably wrap it up, Rob. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We hope that this was informative to you. Again, we invite you to any of our other virtual events coming up in the coming weeks, as well as reaching out to us and our team. We would love to work with you. It really excites us to see the type of work that you're doing and how you're utilizing our toolkits. That's something that really interests us, and supporting you and your different endeavors. So if you do have any questions, yeah, reach out to us.